We left off talking about Louis Kahn and Ann Ting's design for the Yale Art Gallery and how it embodied these two kind of opposing ideas about pure form, precisionist pure form, and brutalist materials, right? Expressed raw materials. And I want to look at how those two ideas track through in Kahn's later career. He was in his early 50s when he did Yale. This was the first kind of big name project that he had, and he had a 25-year career then that it's hard to find another one that produced such innovative and insightful work in such a short period of time. Some of this came directly out of Yale. So Ting and Kahn worked on a proposal for Philadelphia City Hall that would have taken that space frame and sort of blown it up in 3 dimensions, right? Not only as a floor slab, but as a building structure as well. This project is interesting, because it is to me anyway, it's a very, very structurally expressive tower, right? Something that we don't necessarily associate directly with Kahn, but I want to argue is there in a great deal of his work. But also because it marks a transition in Kahn's thinking. Ting left the office shortly after the first version of this project. If you've seen the movie My Architect, you know that the reasons for that were both complex and sad. One of the people who came into the office, though, was a young Penn student who did the rendering of the plaza that you see in the center, and that was Robert Venturi, who would go on to become one of the leading figures in postmodernism. And to my mind, when you look at this project, this is just a direct kind of, Ting's influence with the space frame in the building and Venturi's eventual interest in this kind of cartoony classicism on the plaza really reflect the kind of richness of Kahn's office. Ting worked on one other major project before she left, and that was the bathhouse at the Trenton Jewish Community Center, finished in 1956. A very, very small pavilion, but one where Kahn begins to develop, along with Ting's influence, an idea that he'll come to call servant and served space. In other words, the building is made up of kind of honorific spans that are sheltered by these big pyramidal roofs. But you can see in the kind of tartan grid of the building a very, very Beaux-Arts planning mechanism, right? In the sort of poche of the grid, the giant square columns are all hollow, and they contain some of the services, right? Toilets, entries, boiler, things like that. And Kahn said that this was one of the first places where he realized the potential of a kind of rich structural grid to provide not only the support for the building, but also the hollow space where all of the kind of modern mechanical systems might be held. I don't think there's any question that he was influenced by the appearance of inland steel, right, which has this beautiful stainless steel core that pulls all of the kind of guts of the building outboard of the structure. And you can see this taking shape really at a much larger scale in his work for Richard's Medical Building on the campus of Penn in Philadelphia. We looked at this building when we talked about the role of environmental systems and talked about Kahn's use of these brick, almost like chimneys, to contain both the fire stairs and also a lot of the exhaust ductwork, taking the kind of bad laboratory air out of the building. Kahn, working with a mechanical engineer named Fred Dubin, finding ways not only to handle the onerous mechanical requirements of a laboratory, but to turn those elements into part of the architectural expression. The other piece of Richard's that was important is that Kahn worked for the first time with a structural engineer named August Commandant. Commandant had been doing pre-stressed and post-tensioned bridges in Germany, sort of a desperate engineering project to try to rebuild the infrastructure after World War II. He migrated in the early 50s to New York, New Jersey, and developed his own pre-stressed and post-tensioned consulting firm, but also worked very closely with precast concrete companies. And you can see on the top left these ideas about pre-stressing, right, where you take a stainless steel cable or rod and you put it between these precast blocks where you know the blocks are going to experience tension, right? This is a precast beam on the upper left. And when you load that beam, the stainless steel cable takes most of the tension. And Commandant described it in the little cartoon that you see here. If you pick up a stack of books from the ends, you're basically pre-stressing the books, right? You're putting the bottom of what wants to be a beam into compression, which is going to counteract the natural tendency of that edge of the book beam to go into tension, and therefore it can actually carry its own weight. These on the lower left are some of the precast elements from Richards, and you can see that they have holes drilled in them where stainless steel cables are going to be run. On the right, you see these kind of Lego blocks almost of Richards' structure going into place. That's Commandant wearing a fedora there in the middle. And you can see the drills that are used to literally screw the ends of the stainless steel tendons tight so that they begin to work as kind of super reinforcing in the lower part of these beams. And so in addition to the better known mechanical towers, Richards is also a place where Kahn's kind of interest in structure really begins to blossom. Commandant is a slightly feisty collaborator. The two have an ongoing kind of on-again, off-again relationship that reads almost like a kind of bad marriage, but they're good for each other in the sense that Kahn is a kind of big ideas person. Commandant is a very rigorous calculating engineer in addition to a design engineer. And they feed off each other in ways that I think reflect the sort of richness of the office that we've talked about already. Here is the finished product. Richards with its giant kind of chimney stacks, and you can see the precast structure that Commandant's designed. It cantilevers out from pairs of columns on each side of the lab, and you can see the glass getting bigger and bigger as it sort of takes advantage of the smaller and smaller precast beams. These are kind of perfectly square towers, right? So there's definitely a Platonic geometry, right? Almost a kind of Miesian geometry to it. But there is also this idea that the glazing is patent glazing in stainless steel frames that are, again, factory produced. And you can see those huge expanses of brick on the kind of snorkels where Kahn is very content to let the materials speak for themselves, but also note in these very, very pure prismatic forms. Kahn, the laboratory is sort of a mixed success. It has some glare problems that the scientists don't care for so much, but it proves to be important not only as another building that puts Kahn on the map, as a really truly innovative thinker. Banham writes about the building. He doesn't like it so much. He thinks that the brick clothing basically is hiding the ductwork that, as a mechanical engineer or trained as a mechanical engineer, Banham thinks is the true story. But they have a huge impact, and as we'll see, there are buildings in the high-tech era that reference this structure almost directly. Maybe even more influential, though, it serves as the basis for his second laboratory building. Jonas Salk, the hero of the polio vaccine in the 1950s, is basically told by the March of Dimes, which had been the polio charity, that since they no longer have to pay for all of these iron lungs and rehabilitation facilities now that the polio is being eradicated, Salk can do almost like whatever he wants with a certain amount of the funds that they have. And Salk decides he wants to build his own laboratory to bring in scientists to collaborate on projects like the polio vaccine. And someone tells him basically, well, you've got to go see this laboratory in Philadelphia. And so he goes and visits. Kahn shows him around. asks him, what's your program? And Salk says, I don't really know. Like, what's the program for this? And Kahn gets hired to design Salk's laboratory on the coastline of La Jolla, California. This is the first scheme. What Salk ends up telling Kahn is that he wants a laboratory that Picasso would feel welcome in, and Kahn, of course, sees this as a great challenge. The initial scheme, as you can see, has 4 laboratory wings facing west, actually, over this giant canyon, with residences on one side that never end up getting built, and a meeting house there at the bottom that likewise never gets built. It's one of the great lost Kahn projects that would have been extraordinary. The lab block does get built. It goes through a kind of budget phase where it goes from 4 lab wings down to 2, and where Commandant really has to refine his structural idea and integrate it with a servicing idea to make the laboratories work. And what Kahn ends up doing is taking that idea of the servant and served space that he solved in plan at Richards and basically turning it up into a section, creating these big interstitial spaces that house Vierendeel trusses that carry the lab floors and allow a column-free space below of about 80 feet wide that the researchers can then do basically whatever they want in. Because the Vierendeels are also the service floors, that means that all of the lab services, water, gas, vacuum, air, can all come down wherever the researchers need them. So there's this perfectly flexible lab, the giant open space that you see here. And then in the interstitial levels, you can see that the Vierendeels form this kind of perforated column grid that Fred Dubin, again, can weave his mechanical systems through, taking out the huge amount of extract air that comes out of a lab, but also letting the pipes run wherever they need to run. Now, interestingly, this is an incredibly technical solution, right? The Vierendeel truss comes from Commandant, although Kahn may have suggested it based on some of the things that they did at Richards. The mechanical servicing system comes right out of Dubin. Kahn finds a way in this section to sandwich the two together, leave the served space, the laboratory space, wide open. And then in the middle, the offices that the researchers will use look out into this phenomenal courtyard, right? Paved in travertine, looking out to the west, to sunset and to blue sky. And this becomes one of the most famous spaces in post-war architecture, and rightly so. It is an unbelievable, spiritually resonant space, and must be an amazing place to have an office in, right? An inspiring place to look out into. If you look closely, you can see, though, that this perfectly formed space is rendered in raw materials. The concrete is all as struck. You can see the holes that the form ties, where the form ties held together sheets of plywood on either side of these walls. You can see even the edges of the formwork, right, and the lines that they made on the concrete. All of that is intentional. Kahn detailed the formwork so that you would get this rhythmic pattern of form ties. You would get this almost kind of library of raised edges and shadow gaps showing you where the forms were and in what sequence they were laid. If you look closely, you can see the color differential between some of the strata there. Those are separate pours done weeks apart and therefore in slightly different weather conditions. And Kahn's detailing basically makes you see the panelization, right? The sequence of the construction. It's also true that this space was never actually designed, so to speak. Kahn had always thought about the courtyard space as a garden full of trees. And as the building was finishing up, he got cold feet about his own work. He asked the Mexican architect and landscape architect Luis Barragan to come up and to consult with him. And Barragan looked at this space and, of course, said, "You're already done, right? That it's all finished, that everything around this has been so rigorous and so thoughtful that all you have to do is just let it speak for itself. Don't plant a single tree in the space." And so Kahn did not. And the building literally speaks for itself. Again, the kind of the kind of precisionist idea of a pure space. This is as pure a space as you get in modern architecture, confronted with the facts of the material being used, the raw concrete and the teak and glass infill that you can see enclosing the offices. And Kahn would go on to follow similar processes, blending structure and classical ideas about space, pure form with raw materials, in what I think of as his greatest work, and the one that I think most clearly shows the richness of these two approaches. On the one hand, optimistic about technology and structures and fascinated by that. On the other, wanting to confront us with the realities of raw construction and what goes on a job site. The Kimball was built to house a collection that had been donated by a wealthy Fort Worth family. And Kahn initially had these very, very grand ideas about sort of classical precincts. And you see here, this looks almost like one of those Van Eyck buildings that we looked at, Aldo Van Eyck, where the relentless kind of square grid lets you form these kind of classical spaces. This gets budgeted and begins to start shrinking. And finally, on the right, you see what was sort of left. Interestingly enough, a tripartite scheme, so classical in conception, and certainly with this idea of the kind of indented forecourt, something that comes right out of some of the early ideas Kahn had about monumentality and matching historic form with modern means of construction. What the Kimball is maybe most famous for, though, are these cycloid-shaped vaults that form the interior gallery spaces. And these were a combination of Kahn, as you see on the left, struggling to figure out how to bring daylight into the galleries without bringing direct sunlight in. We see best, of course, in the spectrum of light that the sun gives off. Direct sunlight is terrible for paintings in particular. And so Kahn is, on the left, struggling with ways to bring in a very small quantity of Texas sunlight through the roof to reflect it onto the walls. On the right, you see the finished solution. David Wisdom was the one who was looking through, or David Wisdom and Marshall Myers, were looking through a book on shell structures. They noticed this cycloid shape that Kahn thought had some sort of magic structural properties, although as we'll see it does not. It's sort of somewhere between a circle and an ellipse. And they literally drew these by rolling coffee cans with a pencil along trace paper on a wall. A cycloid is the shape made tracing one point on a cylinder through one revolution, right? This is the odd shape that you get. Commandant was brought on to try to make this work. Kahn had worked with local architects in Philadelphia, Keystone Hood. He and Commandant had a falling out and weren't working together. And Kahn's insistence on putting the skylight down the middle of what he thought of as a vault gave his engineers fits. If the cycloids work as vaults, that's the last place you want to slice them apart. And finally, Nick Giannopoulos, an engineer with Keystone Hood and a good friend of Kahn, said, "We can't do anything with this. You're going to have to go make up with Commandant," basically. And the story is that Commandant looks at this section and says basically, well, if you let me put some extra concrete in the curbs, and if you let me put some stainless steel tendons down here in the base of the vault, it's no problem at all. And Kahn is baffled by this. And what Commandant realizes, of course, is that these are not vaults spanning in the short direction, but they are shells spanning in the long direction. And very much like the roof of the Zarzuela racecourse that Torroja does, very much like the sort of gull wing shells that we looked at in some of the factory buildings when we were looking at long spans. Commandant realizes that basically he can make a sort of an I-beam out of this shape if he thinks of it not as a vault but as a gull wing. The extra concrete here is going to allow that shape to take some compression as it spans basically in and out of the screen here. And down here, the base of the vault, these two little ears are going to be where he uses stainless steel tendons in post-tensioning to take the tension force of the bending that these shells are going to experience as they span about 100 feet from support to support. The mechanical system can be integrated between those little ears, so it's putting supply in one way, bringing out exhaust in the other. And Khan gets his vaults, although he never fully understands that these are not vaults spanning the short direction, but they are shells spanning the long direction. You can see the skylight there. This is Khan office employee Marshall Myers figuring this out in aluminum and perforated aluminum sheet and extruded aluminum metal, extrusions that are then stretch formed. So the office, again, paying very close attention to the way that things were fabricated. And you can see the window slot at the ends of the galleries. This was a sort of signature by Commandant, who wanted you to see that, in fact, the arches that there are arches here that get thicker toward the middle, and what they're doing is they're actually restraining the corners of the shell, preventing it from flattening out, and therefore losing its capacity to take bending. So these arches are thicker at the top, thinner at the bottom. They're basically long, curved cantilevers holding the base of the shell. And they argue about the shape of that window. Commandant finally gets Khan to design a shape that shows you how thick the arch is in the middle, right? It's a really, really nice touch that takes an awful lot of understanding to know exactly what's going on, but gives you the basic sense of how the structure is working. And the detailing of the Kimball is unbelievably precise, right? So even though it is composed of, as you can see, raw travertine, raw concrete, there are these edges in aluminum and in steel that really give you the sort of crisp edges that we associate more with a Mies building, right? More with something that's more purely precisionist. And I think it's this combination of, if you like, the raw and the cooked, right? The kind of brutal and the precise that give the Kimball and the Salk such resonance, that Khan sort of knows where to let the material speak for itself and knows which materials he can use to get that kind of precision that we kind of like to see up against raw materials like that. On the right, these are details from the curtain wall that forms the front of the building. And you can see this is all David Wisdom and Marshall Myers thinking about break-shaped steel and how you can form basically mullions out of it with incredibly tight tolerances. Khan's legacy is multitudinous, right? As I said earlier, Venturi and the postmodernists see him as a father figure. There are a whole slew of phenomenologists who look at the spaces and the play of light that Khan is able to achieve and take that in new directions. To me, the most interesting one, though, involves the people who either worked in Khan's office or tried to work in Khan's office and took his interest not only in materials but also in structure and in fabrication much, much further. A factory building that Khan did in the early 70s for Olivetti, one of the great post-war clients of architecture, that involved these concrete umbrellas, not a sort of A-list Khan work, but Olivetti sent over a young intern who had worked for his family construction business in northern Italy and was interested in working in America and working for Khan. And on the right, you see alternate sketches for Olivetti's roof done in fiberglass and fabric. And these sketches were done by a very young Renzo Piano, who did in fact spend a 6-month internship in Kahn's office and wrote quite often about the fact that this was an incredibly influential moment in developing his own philosophy. Equally interesting, the Yale Art Gallery was also the home to the architecture program. The top floor of it was all architecture studios. And as you can see here, that tetrahedral roof over the long desks that we're probably still all familiar with. Kahn had stopped teaching at Yale by 1961 when the thesis project on the right that you see was done. But surely his influence was pervasive. That thesis project is for a science complex on Yale's campus, and you can see the snorkels and the stacks that are right out of Richards, right? They were right out of the servant served idea that Kahn was pushing. That project was done in part by the gentleman you see sitting on his desk. That is a young Norman Foster, who was a master's student at Yale, had come from Britain, and did his thesis project with another British student named Richard Rogers. And the impact that Kahn had on the two of them was similarly profound. They tried to work for Kahn for a summer, couldn't end up meeting with him in Philadelphia, and instead drove out and spent their summer working in California. However, as we'll see in the next lecture, the influence of Kahn was pervasive on piano, on Rogers, on Foster, and the way that they were able to take this idea of marshaling structure, materials, building technology into legible architectural languages.